Some Chinese emperors have done some of the wackiest things like drinking blood, cooking people, and playing with tigers. I mean, to start off, Chinese emperors in general would chop off their servants' shaft and balls, pickle them, put them into a jar, and then have them wear that jar around their necks, sort of like an ID badge. This is mainly because the emperor had a harem of women who are supposed to only have one guy they're fighting over. So, when you have male servants, there might be some risk of your property getting pregnant. Also, Chinese emperors don't really have to govern. Instead, they've got a bunch of sweaty, nerdy bureaucrats who will govern for them. So, for the most part, Chinese emperors have a ton of free time and way too much power. While this may sound like the ideal life to a lot of viewers of the isekai genre of anime, to be honest, it's usually actually pretty boring, which is why most emperors would just focus on their hobbies. So, let's start with King Zhou of Shang, who had a hobby of
torturing people.
While King Zhou started off just chucking people into snake pits, you know, vanilla shit, eventually this got boring, so he invented a new method where a giant bronze cylinder was filled with hot coals, and a naked guy was forced to hug it. After watching the guy get a nice warm hug, Zhou would apparently be quite aroused by this and use it as foreplay. Zhou also really liked partying, but one time while partying, Zhou noticed a problem. Yo, servant, give me more wine. Yes, Emperor Zhou, one moment please. Wait, what? 1 moment? So, being quite the innovative guy, he built a giant lake of wine and a forest of meats. This way, whenever he started to feel the slightest bit sober, he could reach down and have a drink, and whenever he got hungry, he could reach up and take a bite of some roast. The thing that bothers me though is that the meat must have gotten cold, right? So I mean, he basically just invented a way of eating leftovers. Also, there are some rumors that the meat used on those trees was actually human meat. So really, he was just killing two problems with one human steak. And of course, the most immoral thing King Zhou did, according to Chinese historians, was compose bad erotic poems. Unfortunately, none of these poems survived, but luckily for you, I managed to retrieve one using my imagination. The moonlight bounces off my bed. I wish you were bouncing instead. I look up at the full moon and think about sexy raccoons. Now, as you can imagine, King Zhou's policy agenda wasn't exactly cheap, so taxes were increased. Eventually, all this led to an uprising and Zhou was defeated. He died by being burnt to death.
Ironic.
Unfortunately, though, a lot of modern historians now think that his deeds were actually exaggerated by later dynasties, and he might have actually just been a normal and intelligent ruler, kinda like Caesar. But, although King Zhou's accomplishments may have been fake, this next guy was a certified joker. And I'm not even kidding about that joker part. This guy would actually wear makeup, and he also liked killing people so much that his bureaucrats came up with a plan to keep prisoners lined up outside of the palace in case he was craving a murder. It was literally government policy to make sure this guy had a steady stream of people to kill. The Wenjun Emperor started off as a child to an emperor with a whole lot of heirs. While he was growing up, people thought that he had mental problems since he was socially awkward and very clumsy, so everybody basically assumed that his handsome and stronger older brother would become the emperor. But, as they say, never make fun of an ugly duckling, cause you never know who's gonna grow up to become an ugly emperor duck. Wenjun managed to steal the throne from his brother and had him poisoned. After getting on the throne, Emperor Wenjun got up to all sorts of shenanigans. So like I said before, one of his hobbies was just to execute people. He usually liked the dismemberment method, you know, classic, but sometimes he would get a little creative with it. For example, one time he tied a guy to a giant kite and then threw him from a tower to see if he could fly. Surprisingly enough, the guy actually survived, so as a reward, the emperor left him to starve in prison. Another time, he was jealous that his concubine cheated on him, so he decided to cut off her head. Later, during a banquet, he tossed out her head and then started riffing on her leg like a guitar while singing. Imagine being a dinner guest there. Wow, it's dinner and a show! Bravo to your holy Emperor Wenxuan! Oh, and also, he wanted to merge together Taoism and Buddhism, so he had the best monks debate, and then decided Buddhism won. Then he started cutting off Taoist monk heads.
Oh, and also he had incest with pretty much every single female member of his family clan. Oh, and also he once threatened to marry his mom to a barbarian. Oh, and also he once beat up his son so bad he could no longer speak.
But I mean, he was a very talented method actor, so... You're probably wondering how China as a whole suffered under this clown. Well, China was actually pretty stable, since Emperor Wenchun would actually pay attention to policies, and his bureaucrats were pretty well organized. Also, everybody was way too scared to take bribes for obvious reasons. I wonder what that says about Gotham. Next, Emperor Zhengde. So most historians think this dude is crazy, but to be honest, the more I read about him, the more he just seemed like a Chad to me. So Zhengde grew up as his father's only heir, and when he was a kid, he was known to be very smart and clever, so the ministers had a lot of hope for him as emperor. However, once he became emperor, Zhengde just liked to leave the court and travel around the country. He also liked playing dress-up, and he would oftentimes have his court arranged to look like a street, and then have everybody dress up like merchants so he could pretend to shop. The bureaucrats found this quite insulting, but he would punish those who refused. One time, the Mongols started raiding northern China, so Zhengde decided he would personally stop them, but his ministers weren't too keen on this plan. No, you're not going to fight the Mongols.
But I wanted to command my army to battle.
Listen up, young man. You're not going, and that's final.
Fine, I guess I'll just appoint my General Zhu Shou on the job then.
Fine.
Hey guys, it's me, Zhu Shou, and I'm off to battle.
Wait, what? You can't do that.
Hey man, it's the Emperor's orders.
So you're probably wondering how this teenager with zero military experience handled military command. Well, Zhu Shou traveled north and proceeded to go
Undefeated.
and spank the Mongols back to their plateaus and yurts. In addition to his military escapades, he also loved tigers and leopards and had a separate mansion built just for them. Which kinda means they had better living conditions than me. The cats were not very grateful for the free housing and food though, so one time they tried eating some better food. He also had a habit of just adopting pretty much anyone he liked, so by the time he died, he ended up with hundreds of adopted sons. So like I said, a lot of historians consider this guy to be crazy, but to me he just seems like a Chad. Casually defeated the Mongols, adopted hundreds of sons, wrestled with tigers, then died in a drunk boating accident in his 20s. The next emperor, though, was definitely not cool. He was a certified Taoist cult fanatic. His name was the Jiajing Emperor, and following Taoism, the Jiajing Emperor would mix together blood and lead and consume that, since he thought it would make him immortal. But it wasn't just any old blood. This was menstrual blood that came from 13 to 14-year-old female virgins that were only allowed to eat mulberry leaves. Apparently, the girls didn't like being forced to be vegan, so one night, when Jiajing was visiting his favorite concubine, a bunch of girls strangled him in bed and stabbed his crotch with hairpins. But somehow, the menstrual blood and lead potion must have worked or something, since he managed to survive until the empress found out about it and had the girls executed. So you would think that most 13-year-old girls would be into immortal bloodsuckers, but I guess Jiajing made the classic blunder of not being hot. So you're probably thinking that the Empress must have gotten a huge reward for saving Jiajing's life, right? Well, one time she got stuck in a fire, and when the servants asked if they should help the Empress, Jiajing was like, "Nah, I'm good," and left her to die. This is most likely because the Empress had Jiajing's favorite concubine executed alongside all the other girls. Anyways, afterwards, Emperor Jiajing became quite paranoid and moved out of his palace, and instead went around building a bunch of Taoist temples. Oh, and by the way, the assassination attempt didn't stop him from trying to do that. He still wanted to rule though, but instead of sending normal commands, he would send puzzles and riddles for his ministers to solve. What rises when unwanted but falls when needed? Next, let's talk about what might be the most interesting emperor. So this guy loved having his eunuchs flogged for pretty much the tiniest offense. Gesundheit, Your Majesty. What did you just say to me? Bless you, bless you. He, however, did not carry that same energy into his wedding night. In fact, instead of consummating his marriage, he actually just dashed on out of there. His name was Pu Yi, and at the age of 3, he left his family to become the last emperor of China. At least,
So far.
in the imperial palace, he was surrounded by strangers and eunuchs who followed his every command and worshipped him like a god. But the only person he was ever really close to was his wet nurse. In fact, he continued sucking until the age of 8. He also never really had a moment of privacy, with the eunuchs doing pretty much every task for him, like brushing his teeth, tying his shoes, and he even had a professional shit sniffer, whose job was, you guessed it, to sniff the emperor's defecation and make sure it smelled healthy. But eventually, there was a revolution that overthrew the Qing dynasty, and he was basically forced to abdicate the throne and eventually also forced to leave the imperial palace. But since the Japanese were also invading China, he managed to strike a deal with them and became the emperor of just the Japanese-controlled northeast. Here he was essentially a puppet emperor with no real power. His first wife, the original empress, became super addicted to opium and had an affair with his chauffeur, while his other wife divorced him, which is actually the first time this happened in Chinese history. To soothe his pain, Puyi turned to Buddhism and stopped eating meat and apparently having sex as well. Also, he might have commissioned a wooden sex doll to be used in place of a human girl. Maybe, I wasn't actually able to find an actual source on that last part, so take it with a grain of salt. During this time, the Japanese continued to feed him false promises that he would eventually be restored as the Qing emperor, while everyone Chinese with half a brain, including his own father, warned him about the Japanese. Puyi grew more and more paranoid about being assassinated by either the Japanese or Chinese nationalists. Ultimately, though, Japan lost World War II and left China. Fearing execution, Puyi also tried to flee to Japan, but he was intercepted first by the USSR. As a prisoner in Russia, he was actually treated fairly well and managed to keep his servants. However, he wasn't allowed to flog his servants anymore, so instead he would just slap them whenever they disobeyed him. Eventually, though, the communists won in China, or I mean at least you could call it a draw, so USSR sent Puyi to Mao. As a prisoner in China, he initially tried to deflect blame, saying that there was nothing he could do and that it was all the Japanese's fault. But he was forced to visit the rest of China outside of his palace walls. One time, while visiting the site of Unit 731, where the Japanese would literally experiment freezing and removing people's arms, Puyi said, "All these atrocities had been carried out in my name." Ridden with guilt, Puyi would oftentimes break down and contemplated suicide. He gave up the remaining treasures he had been hiding, and after 10 years he was deemed as reformed and released from prison. He spent the rest of his life as just a normal citizen in communist China. In the mornings, he would normally work as a gardener and then spend his evenings working on his autobiography. He also enjoyed participating in plays and riding his bike as hobbies. Throughout his community, he was known as a kind but clumsy man. He would always be the last person to board the bus, and he would tell waiters that he should be the one serving them instead. He still wouldn't have to tip though. One time, while riding his bike, he accidentally cleared an elderly woman. Afterwards, he visited her every single day in the hospital with flowers until she was released. So, who was Puyi? To me, Puyi seems like just an average guy born in extreme circumstances. I mean, most kids are little psychos until their parents hopefully teach them a lesson. Growing up, he had like one friend. Everyone who ever talked to him wanted something from him, and the first time he ever met a girl his own age was his wedding day. So, although he may have been considered the most powerful man in China, it wasn't until he lost all his power, titles, and wealth, it wasn't until he became a nobody, that he was finally free. Free from his property constantly fighting over him.